Good morning, everybody. Hope you're all self-isolating nice and healthily, doing the sensible things that you're supposed to. I've had a terrible sore throat all weekend and a temperature on and off, sweating like a pig, so I don't know whether I've had it or not. There aren't enough tests and so on. So I don't know. Here's hoping, but I hope you're all well, keeping well, doing okay, and all of that jazz. So it's the only thing anybody is talking about on any news story, and all that anyone seems to be considering is the effect of it. So I guess that's what we're going to talk about, because there's not a lot else we can really talk about. Unless I put in a huge amount of special effort looking for other stories, but that's not what this channel is really about, making an effort particularly. So let's see, any news or anything before we go on. YouTube's activated some new analytics, which lets you see how many people are actually getting reminders that you have a video out. I have nearly 3,000 subscribers over on my main channel. I have nearly 100 on this channel. 100 would be nice, so I can get the custom name and everything. But only about 200 people on my main channel are getting reminders sent to them. So, yeah, less than 10%. And then typical click-through rate when people see a reminder or an advert or whatever is, on a good day, 5%. So you can see the problem. And just last week, my views essentially halved. Anyway, you'd think with more people being at home and everything, there'd be more people watching, but apparently not. So yeah, self-isolation is nothing new for me, but my worst half is home as well. Work did the sensible thing, sent them all to work from home. Yeah, no, there's some positive sides to that in terms of work culture. More of us may get the option to work from home more often. Telecommuting is good for the environment, good for productivity, good for people's mental health, though it can be a bit of a shock. So maybe we'll see what's going on. I might do some sort of generic ranting about the whole situation later on. I am going to try and swallow my nervousness and host some online games, because with so many people being stuck at home and all the rest of it, it's obvious that a lot of people are bored and they need something to do. So if I can do something to alleviate that a little, yeah, probably a good thing. What else? A lot of artists and cosplayers and games designers and authors are taking a big hit to their income, even though they work from home, because so many conventions and other sort of gatherings and meetings and book signings and things are being hit by everything that's happened. So it would be a good time if you do have a regular income to support people. I'm not saying support me. I mean, do that if you want. I've lost a few Patreons recently, but if you got a couple of spare bucks, sling it to someone you appreciate just for a month or two to help them get over the hump. I'm going to be trying to free up some money and do some more sort of rapid projects once I've finalised the writing on Satana Station for Machinations of the Space Princess, so that I can throw some money to some people who are really needing it. Usual thing, comments, etc. I'll deal with at the end, but feel free to talk along as we go through. And let's have a quick look at the news, which is all coronavirus, I'm afraid. One thing I found a little bit more interesting, I mean, everyone knows wear a mask so you don't infect other people. It doesn't help protect you from infection, but it stops your sputum going as far as it otherwise might. And everyone knows about self-isolation and washing your hands and so on. Everyone knows about the infectious aspect. But there is a mental health problem sort of running concurrent with coronavirus. It seems a little bit odd because we're also used to this kind of wired-in world now that you'd think people would be able to cope better. You've got computer games, you've got the internet, you can stay in touch with people, you've got the phone, all the rest of it. So we can stay connected and we can stay human because humans are social animals. But apparently there is a bit of a mental health epidemic going on as well. There are also problems for people with mental health issues who are looking to go into care or access health services for their mental health because they're being both oversubscribed anyway, and especially currently, and because some facilities have outbreaks of COVID-19. A friend of mine who's got persistent suicidal issues can't go to hospital at the moment because of the problem. So yeah, plus they have lung issues and things as well. So bit of a puzzler. But what they're suggesting is that you should avoid watching, reading, or listening to news that could cause you to feel anxious or depressed. There's a temptation whenever there's a crisis to watch a lot of news. So I guess what they're suggesting is, rather than rolling news, just sort of tune in and look at the headlines or whatever once, twice, 3 times a day and leave it at that. This little nugget of advice I found particularly interesting because it relates to male mental health and male mental health issues, because men tend to prefer to do something rather than just talk stuff out. And one of the recommendations they've got around mental health during this crisis is to look for information about practical steps that you can take, about plans to protect yourself and your loved ones and so on. So that's interesting because that's showing that more male-oriented sort of mental health approach that we don't typically see in a lot of care. So that, I thought that was interesting. This isn't like doomsday prepping or anything, but there are practical steps you can take. And they do involve things like laying in some pasta or rice that you can, generally make something with, even if you don't have a lot else. So you've got food, so you don't have to go out so often, all the rest. And like I said, get the updates and the headlines at specific times. So like morning, midday, evening, and then try and leave it out. A lot of people feel out of control around what all this is happening. Less useful was the advice to mute things which are triggering to you and things that upset you, because that will have long-term political and social implications. It's just generally not that useful to cut people off, and there's a lot of people out there who are price gouging, hoarding and reselling, spreading disinformation and so on. So it might be upsetting to see that kind of stuff, but I think it's very, very important to counter that kind of disinformation, just as it is normally around anti-vaccination or whatever else. This is something skeptics should be doing, right? The skeptic community should be doing is debunking bullshit as people come out with it. And maybe I'll take it upon myself to do some of that as well. Check out the BBC site. The article is Coronavirus, How to Protect Your Mental Health. So a lot of it's echoing what I've been saying about working from home. I did a video on how to work from home, and yeah, there's genuinely some practical advice there. A little bit of bullshit, but mostly it's pretty good. So talking about working from home again, if you're a small business, you should ideally already be using that smallness to be flexible, to allow people to work from home, to allow for telecommuting. This just shows how important laying in high-speed internet infrastructure really is, and how essential it is. Because if we can keep the economy going, if we can keep business going as much as possible with people working from home, that just helps offset all the damage that we're having. And honestly, I don't know why more businesses don't allow telecommuting. There are systems now, I mean, phone sex companies use it, where the central office, if there even is one, redirects calls to people's mobile phones so that they can take calls from home wherever they are. So you can clock in while you're at home and be on call and get paid for calls that you take and so on. There's no reason why things like services, online services where you call up and you get advice or they log whatever, there's no reason really whatsoever for most of these places to have buildings that you go into and work at and think of the positive environmental impact and the cost savings in terms of travel and everything else. Another little tip: if you're self-employed, if you can't work or you can't work enough due to the virus, and this would apply even for people on 0-hour contracts and things like delivery drivers and so on whose work might disappear a bit, you can apply for universal credit or employment and support allowance. Now, ESA is what I'm on because I do work, but my illness impacts my capability to work. So you can apply for that for support if you're self-employed, but the coronavirus and attendant issues are impacting your business. Trouble with universal credit is that it takes 5 weeks to process. So you will need a plan to kind of cover the gap and save money in the meantime, borrow, or if you are self-employed, you might be able to get some people to Patreon you or whatever, depending what kind of business you do. In the meantime, but then you will get a back payment, and for however long this crisis goes on, you should be able to get universal credit. It's it's just that 5-week delay that's a bit of a son of a bitch, but apply now if you can. You can get paid early if you're in an emergency situation, but you will then have to pay that back later on, and that can be severely impacting if you end up losing your job. People who are self-employed can't get statutory sick pay. Of course, if you're outside the UK, this will be different, either better or worse, depending. If you've got mortgage payments or are likely to go into rent arrears during this, most banks are being somewhat accommodating. A lot of landlords are being reasonably accommodating. So it can't hurt to talk to people and figure it out. So that's what I would suggest people do. I'm trying to put a sort of more positive, practical, help people out spin for the most part here. But I don't think it's possible to stay upbeat and positive as we continue. The UK's advice, or the UK's approach rather, seems to be let everyone get it, cull the weak, and then hopefully the rest of us will have immunity. That's not what herd immunity is. Herd immunity is when a sufficient amount of people in the population are vaccinated that you slow down or stop the spread, because the people who are vulnerable then end up spaced out through the population that's immune. Things like the colds, the common cold, the flu, things that come back over and over again, those are coronaviruses. COVID-19 is just a new one that really none of us have immunity to yet. So herd immunity isn't really particularly a thing. when it comes to a lot of these illnesses. COVID-19 may or may not be like the rest of them. And it's just generally a bad idea. And projections show that we're going to have about 2 to 3 times as many people needing ventilators at the kind of peak infection if they don't slow things down, if they don't take more drastic measures. And it is nuanced. If you tell everyone to stay home and make everyone panic too early, then they stop behaving, they stop following orders after a while. And if you do it too early, you may end up with lots of people going back out into the world and rejoining business and so on, and spreading it at the exact worst time to do it. So there is nuance, but even so, the approach that the UK government is taking is not a very good one, not a very responsible one. It's a bit left field and whack job, and it's what hardly anyone else is doing. The only nations that seem to have a worse approach than the UK are the US, which is still to a large degree in denial, both within the administration and without, and India, which has been recommending homeopathy. Yeah, homeopathy. Is there hope for a vaccine? Yes, there is. Trouble is, it'll take about 18 months from when this first broke out, which was at the end of January, if I remember correctly. So if we do get a vaccine, it's going to be sometime next year. This is why things like local elections and so on are being delayed by a year. We do have better technology now, and we can more rapidly create vaccines, but before they can be rolled out for people to use, there have to be animal trials, there have to be human trials, the safety and everything has to be checked. All the things that we inform anti-vaxxers about that make vaccines safe and effective, they all have to be run through. Now, there are different types of vaccine, different approaches to vaccination that are being taken. This is what they call plug-and-play vaccines, where they kind of take the genetic information from the vaccine and they put it in weaker, lesser vaccines, lesser viruses, so that via an infection with a safe germ, you can acquire protection against the novel germ. But it's unclear exactly how effective that might be. There's a few other options like viral fragments and so on that they can use to create vaccines. They're already moving into human trials, but it's still early days, and it's unclear if any of these more rapid novel versions will be sufficiently effective. So don't really hold out for a vaccine. When this rolls around, which it almost inevitably will, probably next year, it'll probably be part of the sort of general flu shots that we all get, but or at least the vulnerable amongst us get. But I wouldn't hold out for a vaccine too early this time around. So there's a problem with the ventilators, that we're going to need more concurrent ventilators than we have available here in the UK, has led the UK government to urge industry to help make ventilators for the NHS. These are industries that aren't necessarily particularly set up to do this, so it's unclear whether that's going to help that much, and the UK doesn't particularly have much of a manufacturing industry anymore. These issues are being further aggravated by the fact that we are in the middle of leaving the EU, so the EU is obviously prioritising members of the EU. They've been relatively generous to us. In a way, we're lucky this didn't happen next year, but there are issues around us buying extra ventilators from the places where they are mostly manufactured, like Germany, and I believe there's an industry in Ireland that does it, which would have been the easiest to order them from. So, I mean, this whole crisis just underlines how stupid a lot of approaches are, how many countries, UK, US perhaps particularly, have people in charge who are the worst people to have in charge at this point in history and dealing with this crisis. And Brexit and our antagonism to the EU is just going to be making it worse. People will point and say, oh, what about Italy? Being part of the EU didn't help them. Well, it has. Imagine how much worse it would be if they weren't still full members of the EU and didn't have easy access to rapid transit of materials and easy trade and all the rest of it. They would be having more problems on top of the problems that they have now. I mean, these shortages that we're seeing around things like toilet paper and so on, this is because all of these big businesses can supply these things this cheaply because of just-in-time shipping, right? So they just have what they gauge will be enough stock typically at this time, and they don't ship excess, because if you have to hold stuff in storage, that costs money. If you have too much stuff and you can't sell it, that costs money. If you have to return things, that costs money. So basically all businesses, whether it's manufacturing or consumer goods or whatever else, they're all on that kind of razor thin edge where they aim to have just enough and no more, and rapid and easy shipping and so on is what enables that. So it's not just that trade tariffs and so on could come in when we leave the EU, or that transit across borders is gonna slow down. It's that just-in-time shipping will no longer be possible to the same extent, and so that's going to drive costs up. And that's also why we're seeing these empty shelves and so on, because they're aiming to have enough and no more. And this kind of came out of left field. So everyone seems to be kind of playing it by ear. America, which can't afford to enact universal healthcare, you will remember, have been throwing trillions of dollars at their economy to try and shore it up. A huge stimulus program has been put in. Interest rates have been cut to almost nothing. It's obvious where American priorities are, and to a lesser extent, British priorities. They're prioritizing the economy more than people's lives, and that's the whole US medical system, really. How much money have you got? Not how sick are you. America is not going to do very well out of all this. They're still fairly early in the onset of the disease, but the American healthcare system and the social effects that it's had on people, this is going to be pretty dark unless some kind of miracle happens. I mean, the US population is spaced out more, which may help, but people can't afford to go into hospital. And people can't afford not to go out to work. The precariat, which people who are living paycheck to paycheck essentially in the US, is huge, and a lot of people depending on tips and all the rest of it. And if they can't get that money, if they can't go to work, well, they don't have that option anyway. So that means the disease is more likely to spread more in the US. Less people are likely to seek medical attention, and that's not a good combination. And yet you see a lot of ideologues in the States saying this is all kind of some kind of government conspiracy about government control and how you should defy them and go out. So it's already politicized, and I don't think anyone should be shy of pointing out that a universal socialized healthcare system would cope with this better, or the sheer inhumanity of the existing system in the US. I mean, this is political. This is political and economic. They can find trillions of dollars to flush down the drain to help the banks. They can't find trillions of dollars or effective testing or much of anything else to help actual people. It's just it's that bald and obvious. Talked about the local elections being postponed. Beware of phishing emails relating to the coronavirus. There's a lot of them out there. Lots of people trying to get you to download things and open things that you shouldn't, claiming to be the government or the World Health Organization, or making sensationalist claims about the virus or trying to sell you things. Just be double careful. Many of them will also appear to come from legitimate email addresses, so hover over any links, don't open any attachments. I'm quite sure my audience doesn't really fall for these things, but you might accidentally click on something, so just just be extra double careful. Right, a non-coronavirus story, and one that's fairly happy, I guess. A bunch of Minecrafters have created an online Minecraft library full of banned journalism and profiles of journalists who've been killed and otherwise screwed over in places like Iran. They've built this enormous, fantastical library. There's work by Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist killed by Saudi agents back in 2018. There's a huge amount of books. I mean, Minecraft isn't perhaps the best place to store information. It's not hugely readable or anything, but it's an interesting project. And by tying it into a game and making it downloadable and hostable, it's a way around a lot of censorship and monitoring that goes on, in the same way that people have used Minecraft and other services like that for both good and bad reasons, to evade detection and talk about things outside of the remit of censorship. So it's a fantastic looking build. It's an admirable project. Where did I get that story? Oh, that one's on the BBC as well. So yeah, go and check that out. Minecraft Loophole Library of Banned Journalism is the title, and maybe you can find a place that's hosting it, but it's overloaded at the moment, unsurprisingly. Right, let's see what anyone had to say, shall we? Insomniac says, apparently it's super important to have toilet paper if the panic buyers are anything to go by. It's fairly obvious why people are going for toilet paper. I think people don't want to have to go out that often, right? So they stock up on things that they perceive of as essentials, or anything that will stop them having to go back to the store anytime soon. So that's why they're going for toilet paper, and that's why they're going for rice, and that's why they're going for pasta and all the rest of it. These are essentials, and they don't want to go back out to get them again. That's why. It's that simple, really. It's stupid, but that simple. Jack says there's still a large amount of the population who don't use the internet in the same way younger people do, who are very socially isolated. Yeah, that's true, but there's never been a better time to learn, I guess, at this point. But the workforce certainly tends to skew younger, especially in those groups that do things like services, so on, call centres, that kind of thing. So there's no reason why they couldn't. If that's referring to the mental health stuff, then yeah, I expect older people or people used to a particular way of working and living are going to find it harder. But maybe they'll learn. I've certainly noticed a lot more activity on Twitter and Facebook and places since all this hit. Maybe that's just because there's a disaster that everyone's talking about, but maybe it's also because people are more isolated. Aaron says, thankfully all the schools are shutting down around me in East Texas, even though currently we only have 4 cases. Yeah, they're not shutting schools here, though some schools are taking it on their own initiative. Most businesses are taking it on their own initiative. The thing is, right, governments are a good way to approach this, but only if your government is competent and believes in science and medicine. Unfortunately, a lot of us are in a position where that isn't the case at the moment. So maybe this is an opportunity to kind of preach anarcho-technocracy, give everyone the means to produce for themselves in terms of energy, food, water, etc., and then you create much more robust sort of local networks without having to rely on big government, but using the same principles behind socialism and anarchism. Maybe. But I look at the way lots of people are reacting, particularly the libertarian sort of faction. The amount of people who think this is some kind of conspiracy or bioweapon, or refusing to follow orders just because they don't want to, apparently. And while you see a lot of good people out there doing good things, you do see a lot of hoarders reselling things at a huge markup and refusing to do what's right and good for their neighbours because they see it's too much of an imposition on them. You see the best and the worst of humanity in these times, and it's a hard thing to figure out. Right, I should get on to other things. Like I say, the missus is home, so I don't know. It's very disruptive when you're used to being alone. You know, having someone else around underfoot. It's very disruptive, but we'll figure out what I'm doing. Don't forget to subscribe, and when you do subscribe, do click the bell, and when you do click the bell, do click send all reminders, and when you do click the bell after clicking subscribe, and when you do click send all reminders, don't forget to turn around 13 times, Widdershins, spit over your shoulder, and invoke the dark gods of the Elder Stars, and then maybe you might get some sort of alert when I put out a new video or I'm live on this channel. And do the same over on my main channel. Alright, yeah, like I said, figure out what to do. I'm going to try and commission some people who are down on their luck because of this whole situation to do some art and so on. So I'm going to try and free up some money. So that's my day for the most part. Take care, everyone. Look after yourselves. Stay isolated. Lots of fluids. Be careful. Sang.